Let's talk about decommissioning considerations for a few minutes. So as you know, there's a joint proposal agreement that requires us to look at how do we optimize the amount of time that fuel is in the wet storage. And so in addition to that, as part of the nuclear decommissioning funding, that we've also been asked to look at how do you optimize the current assumptions and be able to reduce the amount of time that fuel is in wet storage. So in order to do that, the initial studies that we're currently performing show that you really need to save some of your older fuel so that for the last couple of cycles of operation, the fuel that's discharged, that is hotter, that you need to be able to have some older fuel to be able to mix within that multi-purpose canister to use what's called regionalized storage to be able to then offload that fuel from the pools sooner rather than later. So what this graph does is it shows current plans in that we are at essentially minimums within the pools today, and that after this last refueling outage, we're planning on doing another loading campaign next summer where we'll load 8 casks. But the question then comes into if we continue with the current plans of doing 2 additional loading campaigns, that in order to let in order to be able to have the last discharged fuel cool to the point where you can offload all of it into dry cask storage, we're looking at a timeline that puts us out to approximately 2033, 2034 timeframe. And so the 2 studies that we're performing right now, one with Holtec, one with Transnuclear, is looking at what does it really take to be able to reduce that window down to as short a period as possible. And that what we're finding for the preliminary results is that if we delay moving fuel out of the pool, that we can shorten that window down to the range of 4 to 5 years instead of 7 to 9 years. And so with that, as the studies finish, we'll have to make some decisions internally as to how many additional loading campaigns we do after next summers to be able to then do the appropriate planning for decommissioning, shorten that window down, which then in turn, once you have all the fuel out of the spent fuel pools, then that allows you to be able to accelerate decommissioning activities.
One of the key issues as you transition into decommissioning is there's a certain point where you take irreversible actions that make it impossible to use the spent fuel pool. And at that point, the option of being able to inspect things inside of canisters on site becomes much more difficult because you no longer have a facility that's capable of doing that. The risk, I think, that you would need to actually reopen a canister for any reason is fairly small, but it's not zero, and therefore that decision to essentially lose or remove the capability to reopen canisters on site is a significant one in the timing of that decision as well. Is there a way to factor that into this overall set of questions about how rapidly one should offload fuel and what the staging should be in terms of the decommissioning?
Yeah, I think that's always part of the discussion that will be involved in the decision-making process. And in addition to that, it'll be, how quickly does DOE and companies like Holtec proceed with interim storage facilities, regionalized interim storage facilities. Correct. That if you end up with a facility in the next 10 years that has the ability to be able to start taking fuel from San Onofre, Rancho Seco, Humboldt Bay, Diablo, then in turn, then you have the options there for being able to reopen a multipurpose canister and do any inspections or any other treatment as appropriate.
That's a very good point, and perhaps it makes it worthwhile to emphasize further. The realistic options for having consolidated storage involve the two applications that are currently at the NRC, one of which has been put on hold
Correct.
due to lack of availability of funding, and both of which face significant uncertainty because there's no current statutory authority for the DOE to use that capability even if it were to become available. I think that when one looks at frankly, the risks that are associated with completing decommissioning and leaving spent fuel on site, and the irreversible action of shutting down the spent fuel pool capability, that it would be prudent to move the fuel to consolidated storage earlier so that you don't have to worry about that risk.
I agree with you, and that's where I think it's fortunate that you have strong senators such as Dianne Feinstein that are becoming very active in this discussion now, and that in turn, hopefully that will help move the needle on consolidated interim storage.
Right. The key issue, though, is that I don't think we're going to see significant private sector investment to get these consolidated storage facilities sited and licensed, at least for the Texas site, unless there's some congressional action to pass some type of statutory language that essentially confirms that if it were to become available, the DOE would use it. And moreover, that they would prioritize taking spent fuel from decommissioned reactors.
Right.
Because there's an obvious set of arguments. I'm pretty sure that the best thing for ratepayers is that you initiate the decommissioning activities very early on. And I think once you stop the use of and shut down salt water, that's pretty much it for being able to use your spent fuel pool. Maybe it would,
unless you bring in package heat exchangers.
So overall, it would be very nice. This is a window of time which is plenty long in a technical sense to complete the licensing review and initiate transfers of spent fuel, particularly away from coastal sites like Diablo Canyon, Songs, and Humboldt Bay.
I agree.
But I have to say that the ability to put that language into appropriations bills or into separate bills has existed for several years, and unless Congress does something, I'm very pessimistic.
Is it correct to say, Jearl, that if fuel has to stay in the spent fuel pool 7 years before you transport it, and your last fuel assembly would be out in 2025, the earliest you could complete shipping the fuel to the dry storage would be 2032?
That's...
In sort of in simplistic terms?
Yes. Although it takes you time to package
right.
and move it.
Is there any way to shorten that 7-year period? Is that reasonable or not reasonable?
It's from the studies that we're currently performing, it is reasonable, but it takes having older fuel available to be able to mix.
Oh, like you were talking about earlier. Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
So far, correct me if I'm wrong, so far all of the fuel transferred from the pools up to the IFC has been assemblies that are intact, and you haven't done any, you have some assemblies from the old days where some of the fuel had failed, right? And is that right?
Now, Diablo is very fortunate in that...
you have a remarkably good fuel performance, by the way. Good
in that we don't have any fuel that we have to consider as failed fuel, and to be able to put in a separate failed fuel container.
That's what I was going to ask. I know that there's some from the old days in there where you had some failures, but my recollection, what you just confirmed, was that nothing is there that has a severe enough problem that you'd have to have a special overpack before it went in to go in. And is that continues to be the case?
That continues to be the case.
Okay, so unless a misfortune brings about some important fuel failures in the next few years, you're not going to have to face any of that interim step.
That's correct. And our license for our facility and then for the multi-purpose canisters allows you to have a number of failed fuel assemblies to where there are 4 locations in each one of the multi-purpose canisters that you can then take a separate container, put the fuel assembly in that separate container, seal it, and then put it inside the multi-purpose.
But that provision has not been required to date, and your expectation is it will never be unless there's some change.
Correct.
Okay.
And Mr. Strickland, in that context, currently this facility has the capability to reopen a cask?
Yes. That was part of the licensing requirements for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
You demonstrated
to reopen the cask.
Yes,
absolutely.
We had to demonstrate that as part of our initial dry runs for operation to be able to show that our process procedures allowed us to do that.
And the capability to do that will be retained up until the spent fuel pool is shut down.
Correct.
But with what you just described, with encapsulation, there's no need to reopen the cask. If you can re-encapsulate it.
It hasn't been so far.
No, I mean, why?
There shouldn't be any reason that you would need to reopen the cask, but, you know.
Right. Let us say there is some failure inside the cask. All you need to do is encapsulate it into another one.
Well, that we don't have a process that's licensed for that at this point. But in turn, that's something that would have to be addressed at that point.
I see. And also, when you talk about optimization effort, so the benefit I can gather from your presentation is about 4 to 5 years shortening of the time in wet storage. Did I get that impression correctly?
Approximately. That we're going through that process right now, trying to finalize the details of the analysis to be able to see how short we can make that window.
Would you provide some context as to how significant is that 4 to 5 year shortening of the time? Is it something worthy of doing, and how much resources does it take to achieve that objective?
So my personal opinion is that it is very worthwhile from the aspect of that even though both systems are safe for wet and dry storage, it moves the fuel from the wet to the dry, and then gives you the ability to be able to stop operation of Vox salt water, to be able to not rely on heat exchangers and other processes to be able to remove heat from that pool and from the fuel assemblies. So it provides a good mechanism for continued interim storage of that fuel. And then in addition, if you start looking at overall cost for decommissioning, that the longer that you have fuel in the pool,
time is money.
The more of a delay in a lot of the decommissioning activities, and the longer you have to maintain vital areas around vital equipment such as Vox salt water to protect that fuel pool. So by being able to shorten that window, you shorten your overall decommissioning, you reduce overall decommissioning cost, and that to me it's a great benefit for customers like myself.
I mean,
you may reduce the risk exposure of the plant by switching to an actively cooling system to a passively cool system.
Correct.
Well, I mean, time is money, but time is also risk, right?
Correct.
I mean, when you said, and I'm not going to argue this, that both systems are safe, but no doubt the IFC is safer than the pools. It's safer, even though both systems are safe, and so of course we want to do what's safer, all things being equal, but it isn't even equal because there's money to be saved as well, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
No, money and time, right?
I think that
so it's all pushes in the same direction.
The key set of assumptions is that the Holtec canisters can be used for transportation. They're licensed for that purpose, but it's not been demonstrated. And it's very likely that they will be able to be used for transportation, but if any issue were to emerge with the canisters, the ability to correct that problem becomes more limited if you don't have a spent fuel pool. So better to move them, start moving them while you still have an operational spent fuel pool, so you can confirm that the whole transportation process can be executed. Because we've not done that with these canisters, I think.
They've done a lot of testing, including the rail car incident and so forth.
Yeah, that wasn't a Holtec canister.
Okay.
That was a much smaller transport canister, because there is a scenario where you conclude that you'd just like to have smaller transport canisters to do the transportation, and that would require repackaging at the site that you're shipping from. These are big objects, right?
That's
So
125-ton transportation package. It's a big package.
Yep. And if you package them into smaller ones, that would change the logistics for the transportation. So I think it's very important for us to push really hard to move towards centralized storage for the spent fuel.
I agree with you.
Well, thank you for a very informative presentation.